Welcome back to Hardball. The killing of bin Laden has unleashed a fierce debate in this country over whether torture actually worked in extracting the necessary intel that led us to his compound. Some Republicans and Bush officials are claiming vindication for the torture methods.
So for those who say that waterboarding doesn't work, to say that it should be stopped and never used again, we got vital information which directly led us to bin Laden. It was during the interrogation of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed through waterboarding that this information was learned.
But others dismiss the idea that bin Laden's whereabouts could be traced back to torture.
To the best of our knowledge, based on a look, none of it came as a result of harsh interrogation practices.
So which is it? Democratic Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island is a member of the Armed Services Committee. Thank you, Senator Reed, for joining us. So what's your take on this? Did torture work? Did we need it or what?
Torture is not only illegal, but it leads to inaccurate information. If you talk to professionals, the men and women who are trained interrogators, they understand it takes a long process. It takes an understanding of the psychological sort of strengths and weaknesses, not gained by torture, but gained by discussion, observation. It takes a long time, and then that information has to be corroborated. It has to be checked against other information. So, no, torture is not the magic silver bullet. If it was, then why did it take us 10 years or many, many years after the waterboarding of these individuals to find bin Laden?
Well, what about the accounts we're getting that the interrogations, the rough interrogations with use of some, what most of us would call torture of Qahtani, KSM, and al-Libi, KSM's replacement in al-Qaeda, that they all led us to this fellow, this courier who had the nom de guerre, the code name of al-Kuwaiti. I mean, was that all part of finding the courier and tracking him to Peshawar and tracking him eventually to the compound?
I think you can ask the question also if other techniques, more sophisticated techniques, not involving torture, had been used. One, would we have gotten the same nickname? And two, I think properly, would we have gotten more information? The individual in charge of the interrogation of the lead that led us to Zarqawi in Iraq, and we took him out with a smart bomb, made it very clear that he was able to develop a relationship with this source that not only got a nickname, but got the location. So this issue of what led to what, it was a very complex process. Information came in, but I don't think anyone has made the credible case that there was such good, clear, unequivocal information from waterboarding that led us directly to bin Laden. In fact, it took years and years and years of intense work to get to bin Laden.
Let's take a look at what the CIA director, Leon Panetta, had to say about this question, the usefulness of torture. Let's listen.
We had a multiple series of sources that provided information with regards to this situation. Clearly, some of it came from detainees and the interrogation of detainees, but we also had information from other sources as well. They used these enhanced interrogation techniques against some of these detainees. But I'm also saying that, the debate about whether we would have gotten the same information through other approaches, I think is always going to be an open question.
Well, here's Jose Rodriguez, who ran the CIA's counterterrorism center when top al-Qaeda leaders underwent torture. He was under Bush, said information provided by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Farik al-Libi, that was who replaced him, about bin Laden's courier, was the lead information that eventually led to the location of bin Laden's compound and the operation that led to his death. So there you have a guy, Rodriguez. Do you think he's credible or not as a person reporting on this? He was part of the problem back then we all know about.
Well, I think he has great insights because he was there. But I think, again, with other professionals who've dealt with interrogation would say that that's a source, but it's not the best source. And in fact, because of the legal complications, it's something that not only doesn't give us valuable information or viable information sometimes, but it also leads us to intense criticism. Frankly, I think looking back over these years, and I think there should be a very thorough analysis, as Leon suggests, of what contributed to our ultimate success. But looking back over it, it was putting together lots of different pieces of information. And the inference that I have, and I think Senator Feinstein has reflected, is that a lot of this information was obtained the traditional way, the interrogations that are permissible under law, the electronic surveillance, the overhead surveillance, all these pieces led one to another.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island. Thanks for coming on Hardball. Cliff May is president, actually, of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Cliff, thank you for coming on. This is murky. I'm getting almost like a Rorschach test. Depending who you ask, you get different responses. John McCain, of course, who was a prisoner all those years in Vietnam at the Hanoi Hilton, of course, was tortured many of those years, doesn't like torture. Dianne Feinstein's chair of the Intelligence Committee in the Senate side, she doesn't like it. The Bush people, as a group, say that it worked. They are for it. I'm not learning much here. It looks like it's murky. Your view?
Yeah, look, I'm somebody who is against torture, but I don't think all coercive, harsh, stressful interrogation procedures are necessarily torture. I think what we know in this instance, and the evidence, or at least the evidence is pretty strong, is that harsh interrogation methods, particularly of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and, of course, Abu Faraj al-Libi, gave the first intelligence from which was built the trail that led to bin Laden. It was based on this.
Explain that, harsh, please. Well, I've been trying to figure out. They came up with a name, a nom de guerre, this guy called al-Kuwaiti. How did that help? They didn't know who he was. How did it help?
That's right. In other words, they had a nom de guerre, and they started with that. And then they had also, and this is also controversial, a warrantless wiretapping of a phone call, and they made a connection, and they eventually figured out who this courier was, who was going to see Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Once they had his nom de guerre, his fake name, then they could trace his real name, who he was, and follow him and know where he was going. And then they just had to establish that where he was going was indeed the house.
You just jumped over the fence with me, Cliff. You jumped over the fence. How did you get from knowing his nickname or his code name, his nom de guerre, to who he was? How did they find out who he was?
That's where you get into the warrantless wiretap. There was a phone call made, the name was used, they checked the phone records, and they found that they believed that they now had the actual courier, they had a phone number, and they had a name, and they had somebody they could follow. Here's the thing, Chris. You can be against waterboarding, you can be against torture, you can be against other coercive techniques such as sleep deprivation if you want to. But I think if you look at the evidence, and you and I could sit down with a couple of people and really look at it hard, you'd have to say that the intelligence that led to the killing of bin Laden began with harsh interrogations, particularly of two high-value individuals, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Faraj al-Libi. I think that much is pretty clear. Now, you can say, but we could have done it another way. Maybe, but it wasn't done another way in this particular instance.
Fair enough. I don't even know where I stand. I don't like waterboarding, but I tell you, you know, who does? But, well, some people do. But the freezing of the guy, the freezing of him to the point where he's in the hospital a couple of times, I don't think Geneva would accept that. Do you?
You know what?
Do you think that's consistent with Geneva Conventions, freezing somebody to the point they go to the hospital a couple of times?
Here's what I think, Chris, and I think you might even be able to agree with me. What you should have are very strict sets of procedures that you can use if you need to in high-value cases. And in some cases, only the president should be able to sign off and say, okay, in this instance, you got to do this. And there are some methods that should be ruled out no matter what, always.
Okay,
but other methods you should use.
I love the idea the president has to do it. He is commander-in-chief, and he has to defend us ultimately. The trouble is trying to get these guys to put their signature on a torture order. Well, anyway, thank you.
When you've got Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, you may want to consider it. He was somebody special.
It might be easier to get. It might be easier to get that order from a Republican than a Democratic president. Just guessing, but maybe not. After watching this week, I'm not sure that the President Obama isn't as cold-blooded as anybody. Let's go on here.
You know what?
Thank you, Cliff May.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he may have been waterboarded. I don't think that was unjust. Osama bin Laden was killed. I don't think that was unjust. I'm not sure you disagree with me on either of those points.
Okay, let's go up. Thank you very much, Cliff May, for coming on.